The German radio operator's voice cracked with disbelief. A single aircraft, American fighter, inside the convoy. Moments earlier the channel had been quiet. Gray water, low clouds, the steady rhythm of engines pushing cargo ships toward the safety of occupied French ports. Then chaos exploded across the radios. Flak batteries opened fire. Ships began turning in different directions. Orders overlapped and contradicted each other as officers struggled to understand what was happening, because the attack made no sense. Only one aircraft had appeared, one fighter screaming low across the water. And somehow that single machine had thrown an entire convoy into confusion. But the real question wasn't what the American pilot destroyed that morning. The real question was how a lone Navy fighter had ended up hunting German ships in the English Channel at all. In the spring of 1944, the English Channel had become one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world. To the south lay the fortress of Nazi-occupied Europe. To the north, the crowded airfields of southern England, where thousands of Allied aircraft waited for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Between them churned a narrow strip of cold gray sea that had swallowed fleets and empires for centuries. Now it had become a corridor of war. German supply convoys moved cautiously along the French coast, carrying ammunition, fuel, and equipment between ports. They hugged the shoreline whenever possible. Closer to land meant closer to shore batteries and defensive guns. But it also meant flying directly beneath the eyes of Allied reconnaissance aircraft that photographed every inlet and harbor. The convoys moved mostly at night. Darkness offered the only real protection left. Still, many ships never reached their destination, because by early 1944, Allied fighters had begun hunting them aggressively. Among the units flying those missions was a squadron few people expected to see in the skies over France. U.S. Navy fighters. Aircraft originally designed for aircraft carriers and Pacific Island battles were now operating from muddy airfields in England. Grumman F6F Hellcats and older F4F Wildcats flew alongside Army Air Force fighters, patrolling the channel and striking German shipping whenever it appeared. The Navy's role in the European theater was often overshadowed by the massive naval battles unfolding in the Pacific. But the pilots flying over the channel faced dangers every bit as lethal. Channel weather was miserable. Low cloud ceilings. Fog banks that rolled across the sea without warning. Rain that smeared cockpit glass until the horizon disappeared completely. Pilots learned to navigate by instinct as much as instruments. Sometimes they followed the faint outline of coastlines. Sometimes they guessed. And when they found a convoy, they had to attack through a storm of gunfire. German convoy escorts bristled with weapons. Fast patrol boats and escort vessels carried 20mm and 37mm cannons designed specifically to destroy low-flying aircraft. Larger ships mounted heavy guns capable of reaching bombers thousands of feet above the sea. Shore batteries added another layer of defense. To attack one of these convoys meant flying directly into overlapping rings of flak. Most pilots still did it, because every cargo ship destroyed meant fewer supplies reaching the German army preparing to resist the coming invasion. The sound of a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine at full power was unmistakable. A deep, thunderous roar that shook the entire airframe. The Hellcat was a large fighter, bigger and heavier than many of its opponents. It had been built for the brutal carrier battles of the Pacific, where durability mattered as much as speed. Over the channel, those same qualities made it ideal for low-level attacks against shipping. The missions followed a familiar pattern. Take off before dawn, climb through thick cloud, cross the channel at altitude, then descend through gaps in the weather to search for ships moving along the coast. Sometimes pilots returned with nothing but empty fuel tanks. Other days they found convoys. And when they did, the sky turned into a storm of tracers and exploding shells. One of the pilots flying those missions was Lieutenant James Pickens. Everyone in the squadron simply called him Pick. He came from central Illinois, where the farmland stretched so flat that the sky seemed enormous. Before the war, the most exciting thing that happened most weeks was a thunderstorm rolling across the prairie. Pick learned to fly in a battered open cockpit biplane at a grass airstrip outside his hometown. He paid for his lessons with money earned working neighboring farms during the summer. When the United States entered the war, the Navy found him like it found thousands of other young men, eager, determined, and willing to risk everything for the chance to fly. He earned his wings at Pensacola, surviving the brutal training program that eliminated nearly half of every class. Those who remained became naval aviators. Pick graduated near the top. Soon afterward, he was assigned to a fighter squadron forming on the West Coast. The early months in the fleet taught him lessons no classroom could provide. Carrier landings in rough seas. Long patrols over empty ocean. The strange camaraderie of ready rooms where pilots joked and played cards while knowing that some of them would not survive the week. Pick was quiet by nature. He watched more than he talked. He studied the veterans who had already seen combat. He observed how they inspected their aircraft, how they scanned the sky even during routine flights, how they positioned themselves in formation so they could see threats first. Every detail went into a mental library of survival. By the time his squadron transferred to England in late 1943, Pick had logged more than 400 flight hours in Navy fighters. He already understood something many young pilots learned too late. Air combat was not just about courage. It was about observation and timing. The difference between seeing first and seeing too late. Europe was a shock. The weather was colder. The skies darker. The enemy defenses far more organized. German flak batteries worked with terrifying precision. Convoys were protected by layers of guns that could fill the sky with exploding metal in seconds. Pick flew his first Channel patrol in January 1944. They found nothing, just gray water and biting wind. His second mission located a small convoy near the coast of Brittany. 3 cargo ships and 2 escort vessels. The flight leader made 2 strafing passes before the flak grew too heavy. They turned for home. Pick watched carefully during those attacks. He studied the patterns of the gunfire, the arcs of tracer rounds rising from the escort ships. He noticed something important. The German gunners always focused first on the leading aircraft in an attack run. They aimed where experience told them the fighters would appear. The same place. Every time. Pick stored the observation away. Another small piece of information. Another entry in the library he was quietly building. Over the following months, he flew mission after mission. He learned the moods of the channel. Where fog banks gathered, which coastlines were heavily defended, which stretches of water offered gaps in the German flak coverage. He also learned patience. The best attacks did not come from rushing directly at the enemy. They came from watching first, understanding the pattern, then striking when the defenders least expected it. By spring, Pick had been promoted and given command of his own flight section. He was 23 years old, and he had begun thinking about a dangerous idea. What if the entire method of attacking convoys was wrong? By early 1944, convoy attacks had become a problem of simple mathematics. German supply ships still moved along the French coast despite hundreds of Allied sorties. Fighters damaged vessels, occasionally sank them, but the cost was rising. Every attack meant flying directly into a carefully prepared wall of anti-aircraft fire. The standard tactic was simple. A full squadron, 12 or more fighters, would approach from medium altitude. They would dive together, fire their weapons, then climb away before the flak grew too intense. It worked often enough, but it was predictable, and predictability was deadly. German gunners knew exactly where American fighters would appear. They had practiced those attack angles for months. Their weapons were already aimed where experience told them the aircraft would come from. The sky above the convoy became a killing zone. Pick saw the consequences every week. Empty bunks in the barracks. Pilots who never returned from patrol. New replacements arriving with barely enough experience to survive their first missions. He began running the numbers in his head. At the current loss rate, a pilot flying Channel convoy strikes had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of finishing a full combat tour. Those odds were unacceptable, and Pick believed the problem was not courage. It was tactics. He began studying the attacks in detail. He read every after-action report he could find. He spoke with pilots who had survived convoy strikes. He asked the same questions again and again. Where were the guns located? Which ships fired first? How quickly did the gunners react? Gradually a pattern appeared. German flak defenses were powerful, but they were also rigid. Heavy guns could not turn quickly. Smaller weapons needed time to track targets. Gun crews expected attacks from above. Their entire defensive system was built around that assumption. Pick started thinking about the opposite. What if the attack came from below? Flying extremely low over the channel was dangerous. At combat speed, a pilot had almost no margin for error. A moment of distraction could send the aircraft straight into the water, but low altitude also offered advantages. Heavy anti-aircraft guns struggled to depress far enough to hit aircraft flying near the waves. Radar detection was less effective, and a fighter approaching at 50 feet above the sea could appear almost without warning. Pick believed surprise could accomplish something firepower alone could not. It could break the defender's coordination. He first explained the idea during a weather delay in March. Rain hammered against the roof of the operations hut while the pilots waited for the storm to pass. Pick laid out his reasoning carefully. Approach at wavetop height. Use clouds or fog as cover. Strike quickly and disappear before the gunners could react. The other pilots listened with interest, but also concern. Flying that low over water meant one mistake could kill a man instantly. The squadron commander heard the proposal and eventually rejected it. The official doctrine remained unchanged. Convoys would be attacked by coordinated squadron strikes. No improvisation. No freelancing. Pick accepted the decision. But he kept thinking. And he kept watching the channel. The opportunity came on a cold morning in April 1944. 4 Hellcats were flying armed reconnaissance along the French coast between Brest and Saint-Nazaire. Intelligence believed a small convoy might be moving through the area. The weather was miserable. Fog drifted across the sea in thick patches. Clouds hung low enough to almost touch the water. Twice the flight leader considered turning back. Then the convoy appeared. 4 cargo ships. 2 escorts. Moving slowly along the coast. The flight leader radioed the sighting and began climbing for the standard attack approach. Pick followed. Then he noticed something. A dense bank of fog drifting toward the convoy's flank. It completely blocked the escort ship's view of the open water. Pick realized something instantly. That fog could hide him all the way to the target. Without warning, he broke formation. His Hellcat rolled downward and plunged toward the sea. Behind him, the radio erupted with angry calls from the flight leader. Pick did not answer. He leveled off barely 50 feet above the water. The gray horizon blurred ahead. He adjusted his course slightly, staying inside the moving fog bank. The convoy suddenly appeared directly in front of him. Large ships emerging from the mist like dark shadows. Pick's thumb moved to the gun switch. 6 50 caliber machine guns waited inside the Hellcat's wings. He attacked from the convoy's flank. The first burst smashed across the lead cargo ship's bridge. Glass shattered. Metal fragments scattered across the deck. Crewmen dove for cover. Pick crossed the ship's bow and fired again. Another burst tore through lifeboats and deck equipment. Then the flak began. But the gunners were confused. They had expected aircraft diving from above. Instead, a fighter had appeared inside their formation at wave height. Tracers streaked past Pick's cockpit, but most of them passed behind him. The gunners were aiming where the aircraft should have been, not where it actually was. German radios filled with frantic shouting. Reports of an American fighter among the ships. Requests for direction. Conflicting orders from convoy commanders trying to understand the attack. Pick pulled up just high enough to clear the convoy's masts. Then he dove back to wave height on the opposite side. One escort ship turned sharply, trying to bring its guns to bear. That movement exposed the vessel's bridge. Pick fired another burst into the superstructure. Then he was gone. The entire attack had taken less than 30 seconds. He climbed through fog and rejoined his flight. Behind him, the convoy was in chaos. Ships were scattering. Guns were firing in random directions. The careful defensive formation had completely collapsed. When the other 3 Hellcats arrived moments later, they found a disorganized target. Their attack finished the job. One cargo ship burned heavily. Another began listing. And for the first time in weeks, every American aircraft returned safely. The debrief that afternoon was tense. Breaking formation without orders was a serious offense. The flight leader was furious, but the intelligence officer listening in the room was intrigued. Because the results were undeniable. A successful convoy attack. Significant damage inflicted. And no American losses. Pick explained his reasoning calmly. The key, he said, was confusion. One unexpected aircraft could disrupt an entire convoy's defense. Once that confusion started, the rest of the strike could exploit it. The squadron commander listened carefully. Then he made a decision. They would test the idea. Within weeks, other pilots began experimenting with the same approach. Low, fast, unexpected. Soon the pilots had a nickname for it. They called it the Pickens Run. And along the French coast, German convoys began facing a new threat. American fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish again before the gunners could react. By May 1944, the technique had begun spreading quietly through the ready rooms of southern England. Not officially, not in written orders, but pilots talked. They shared stories over coffee before dawn briefings and over cigarettes after long missions. And the stories always followed the same pattern. A fighter appearing suddenly at wave-top height. German gunners reacting too late. Convoys thrown into confusion before the main strike even began. The results were not perfect. Flying that low over the channel carried its own dangers. A single mistake, an unexpected wave, a moment of disorientation and fog, and the aircraft could vanish into the water before the pilot even realized what had happened. But the numbers began to tell a different story. Losses during the initial attack runs were falling. Convoys were being damaged more frequently. And German defensive fire was becoming increasingly chaotic. The ready rooms gave the tactic a name. They called it the Pickens Run. Pick himself never used the term. To him, it was simply another adjustment, another attempt to tip the balance of survival by a few precious seconds. As the summer approached, the tempo of operations increased dramatically. Everyone sensed that something enormous was coming. Pilots didn't know the exact date of the invasion, but the signs were impossible to miss. Aircraft filled every available airfield. Convoy patrols intensified. German coastal defenses were attacked daily. The skies over the channel rarely stayed quiet for long. Pick flew mission after mission, refining the method each time. He learned to read the water beneath him like a map. Subtle color changes revealed sandbars or shallow currents that could help him confirm his position even when clouds hid the coastline. He learned to identify convoy escorts instantly from their silhouettes. Different ships meant different gun arrangements, different firing arcs, different blind spots. And he discovered something unexpected. At extremely low altitude, the sound of his Hellcat could become a weapon. A radial engine roaring across the water at full power sounded enormous, far larger than a single aircraft. Sometimes the noise alone caused chaos among the crews on deck before the attack even began. On June 4, 1944, 2 days before the Normandy invasion, Pick led a section of fighters toward the Raz de Seine passage off the coast of Brittany. Intelligence had spotted a convoy moving through the narrow waters. When the Hellcats reached the area, the pilots realized immediately that this was no ordinary target. 8 cargo ships. For escort vessels. A large formation for that part of the coast. Which meant the cargo was important. And important convoys were heavily defended. The weather was unstable. Broken clouds rolled across the sky. Rain squalls drifted over the water. Visibility shifted constantly. Clear one moment, almost blind the next. To most pilots, it would have been dangerous flying. To Pick, it looked like perfect cover. He approached from the landward side, the direction the Germans least expected. His Hellcat skimmed across the sea so low that the propeller wash disturbed the surface of the water behind him. He timed the attack carefully. A heavy rain squall drifted across the convoy just as he closed the final mile. The moment visibility dropped, he struck. The first sound the German crews heard was the tearing roar of machine gun fire. Pick's opening burst slammed into the bridge of the lead escort vessel. Windows shattered. Metal plates splintered. Men scattered across the deck. Before the gunners could react, he was already past them. But he didn't leave. He circled back. That was the part that made the tactic truly dangerous. Pick made a second pass from the opposite direction, slightly higher, forcing the convoy to believe multiple aircraft were attacking. Then a third. Each pass came from a different angle. Each forced the German gunners to shift their fire in a new direction. From the convoy's perspective, it felt like a coordinated assault by several fighters. In reality, it was still only one. By the time the rest of Pick's section arrived, the convoy's defenses were already collapsing. Ships were turning independently. Gunners fired wildly into clouds and rain. The carefully organized defensive formation had disintegrated. The other Hellcats attacked conventionally. This time the flak could not organize quickly enough. When the smoke cleared, the convoy was finished. 2 cargo ships were sinking. A third drifted helplessly in the water. 1 escort vessel burned fiercely, but Pick's Hellcat had taken hits during the third pass. A 20mm shell tore through the wing root, severing hydraulic lines and damaging the aircraft's control system. Another round shattered part of the canopy, spraying sharp fragments of plexiglass across his face and arms. He flew back toward England half-blinded, gripping the stiffening controls with brute strength as the damaged aircraft struggled to remain stable. The channel stretched endlessly beneath him. Gray water, gray sky, the kind of distance that felt far longer than the map suggested. When he finally reached the airfield, the landing was rough. Hydraulic systems were failing. Brakes barely responded. The Hellcat skidded across the runway, veered sideways, and spun off the edge of the field before stopping in wet grass. Ground crew ran to the cockpit expecting the worst. Instead, they found Pick still conscious, blood running down his face, but already trying to climb out of the aircraft. His first question was simple. Did we lose anyone? The answer was no. Every pilot had returned. His second question concerned the convoy. The intelligence officer confirmed the damage. 3 ships destroyed or disabled. 1 escort burning. The convoy's mission effectively stopped. Pick nodded quietly. Then he stood beside his battered Hellcat while medics cleaned the cuts from his face. Within a week, he would be flying again. 2 days later, on June 6, 1944, the war changed forever. The Allied invasion of Normandy began. Thousands of ships crossed the channel. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky. The German defenses that had once protected convoys now struggled to respond to an invasion army landing across the coast. Convoy hunting soon became a secondary task. But the lessons learned in those months before D-Day did not disappear. They spread through debriefings, training reports, and the quiet conversations pilots always share with one another. Low-level disruption attacks became a recognized tactic. Different squadrons adapted the idea in different ways. But the principle remained the same. Surprise could reduce losses more effectively than sheer firepower. James William Pickens survived the war. He continued flying missions through the liberation of France before eventually returning to the United States. For the remainder of the conflict, he served as an instructor, passing his experience to younger naval aviators. After the war, he returned home to Illinois. He finished the college education the war had interrupted. He married his childhood sweetheart, and he spent the rest of his life farming the same land his grandfather had once worked. He rarely spoke about the war. When relatives asked, he described the aircraft and the weather, the cold wind over the channel, the long patrols, the mechanics of flying. He avoided talking about danger, or death, or the calculations he had made in the cockpit. Years later, historians studying naval aviation tactics discovered something interesting. In the archives, they found after-action reports describing the development of new convoy attack methods during 1944. Again and again, those reports referenced a pilot whose low-level attacks had disrupted German convoys and reduced Allied losses. The documents eventually traced back to one name, James William Pickens. When a historian interviewed him decades later, Pick responded with typical modesty. He never claimed credit. He simply explained his reasoning. Then he said something the historian never forgot. The war killed a lot of good men, Pick said quietly. Men who did everything right and still didn't make it home. He looked for a moment at a framed photograph of a Hellcat hanging above his fireplace. If anything I figured out gave some of them a better chance, he added, then that's enough. James Pickens died in 1994 at the age of 79. His obituary mentioned his farm, his family, and the quiet life he built after the war. It did not mention the channel. It did not mention the convoy he shattered with a single Hellcat. But in the doctrine of naval aviation, in the principle that surprise and disruption can defeat stronger defenses, his idea still lives. He found a better way to fight. And somewhere, in the long mathematics of war, that discovery helped more pilots come home.